The arrival. Marcus Williams's journey to his new position as the captain of a small-town police department began long before he'd set foot in his car that night. Though he'd spent years serving in larger, more progressive precincts, where his skill and steady-handed leadership earned him hard-won respect, Marcus knew this small-town assignment would be like nothing he had ever faced. He hadn't just chosen this path. He'd accepted it. For him, stepping into this role wasn't just about another career move. It was about breaking barriers, proving himself yet again, and leading with integrity in a place that had long resisted change. The night stretched ahead as Marcus navigated the winding, narrow highway lined with trees that closed in like silent sentinels on either side. Jazz notes floated softly from his car's speakers, a comfort he rarely allowed himself but found necessary for this journey. Tonight, he didn't feel the usual blend of calm confidence and anticipation. The thoughts buzzing in his mind brought a sense of unease that was rare for him. The department he was about to lead had a reputation, one that anyone familiar with law enforcement circles would know. Whispers had reached him even before he had accepted the post. It was a department rumored to be rife with bias, one that operated on codes as antiquated as the town's unspoken traditions. As his car advanced through the sparse countryside, Marcus's mind drifted to his father's advice. Cooler than ice in the heat, his father had always told him. A retired police sergeant, his father had been a source of strength and wisdom, always reminding Marcus to remain steady and unyielding even in the face of blatant prejudice. "They'll test you, son. They'll want to see if you can take it, if you can endure." And he'd been right, more often than not. Marcus had faced situations that would have driven others out of the field entirely. Yet each test only made him more resilient, each slight harder to penetrate the armor he'd crafted over the years. As he glanced at his GPS, Marcus noted he was about 2 hours away from the town. The road was deserted, except for the occasional farm lights in the distance and the distant rumble of an 18-wheeler lumbering by. He thought of pulling over to stretch his legs but decided against it, sensing that this wasn't the kind of road that would welcome a stranger stopping. Small towns had their ways, their unique currents of tension and unspoken rules. Marcus knew he'd be seen as an outsider even without the added complexity of being a black man in a place where uniformed authority had always looked a certain way. But he wasn't afraid of the isolation. He welcomed it, saw it as another challenge to conquer. The miles melted away as his car powered through the dark, and soon he saw a flickering gas station light on the horizon. He debated stopping but felt a surge of resolve to keep moving forward, letting the rhythm of the road keep him steady. As he neared the town's outskirts, a flicker of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror, accompanied by the piercing wail of a police siren. Marcus felt a tightening in his chest, not from fear, but from an all-too-familiar sense of tension. "Not now," he muttered to himself, glancing at the patrol car closing in behind him. He signaled and gently guided his car to the shoulder, feeling the familiar churn of gravel beneath his tires. Marcus rested his hands calmly on the steering wheel, drawing a deep breath and watching as 2 officers emerged from the patrol car. The first officer, tall and stocky with a shaved head, approached from the driver's side. His partner, shorter and seemingly indifferent, took his time walking around the back of Marcus's car, examining it with an air of disinterest that felt more like disdain. Marcus knew the setup all too well. The taller officer, who Marcus would later learn was Officer Johnson, seemed to be the enforcer, while his partner, Officer Miller, played the role of instigator. Johnson tapped on the driver's side window with a gloved hand, prompting Marcus to roll it down. He leaned in, his face partially obscured by the brim of his hat, though the smirk on his lips was all too clear. "License and registration," Johnson barked, his tone an aggressive show of authority that went beyond procedure. Marcus handed over his documents in silence, noting the quick, cursory glance Johnson gave the license before looking back at him with a gleam of derision. The next question hit harder than the officer might have intended. "What brings you out here this late?" Johnson sneered, glancing over Marcus's car, with a look that suggested he found something amusing. "This ride doesn't look like it belonged to someone like you. Fancy set of wheels. You come into some money recently." The insinuation was unmistakable. Marcus felt the urge to sigh but suppressed it, keeping his voice even. "I'm headed into town for work." "Is there an issue, officer?" The question lingered in the air, seemingly amusing Johnson, who looked back at his partner as if to share the joke. "Well, that's funny," Johnson continued, his smirk widening. "A job, huh? What kind of job you think we got here for someone like you?" The frustration Marcus felt was tempered by years of experience. He knew these comments were bait, hoping to spark a reaction. It was a dance he knew well, one that he'd grown weary of over the years. He kept his tone steady, not giving Johnson the satisfaction. "I'll be starting a new position at the police department," he said, keeping his answer intentionally vague. Miller finally spoke, chuckling in disbelief. "You? At the department? You sure you're not lost?" They both laughed as if Marcus had delivered a punchline. He maintained his composure, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He knew better than to react, to give them any reason to escalate this encounter. Finally, he looked Johnson squarely in the eye, calm but firm. "Am I free to go?" For a brief second, Johnson's smirk faltered. He glanced at Marcus's badge, then back at him, his confidence momentarily shaken. But the swagger returned in an instant, and he waved the documents dismissively in Marcus's face. Yeah, just keep your speed in check. Wouldn't want to see you pulled over again." Marcus took his license and registration back, and without another word, drove off into the night, his hand steady on the wheel. He didn't look back. Tomorrow, they'd know exactly who he was, and the real work would begin. The first morning. The dawn spread over the quiet town as Marcus sat in his parked car outside his hotel, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. The encounter with Officers Johnson and Miller the night before was still fresh in his mind. He'd seen the moment of disbelief when they finally understood who he was. The man they had taunted and humiliated was, in fact, their new superior. But he knew he'd face much more than a stunned silence. The entire town would know soon enough, and the small police department would undoubtedly bristle at the arrival of an outsider, especially one coming to challenge their entrenched norms. After a quick shower and a careful, deliberate arrangement of his captain's uniform, Marcus took a final look in the mirror. His reflection bore the signs of hard-won experience, a man who had faced countless battles, who understood the gravity of what he was walking into, but held his composure, strength, and purpose. This was not a routine assignment. This was a place that would demand all his patience, resilience, and determination. Arriving at the police station a little before 7, Marcus parked his car in the designated spot for the captain. A symbolic but powerful reminder to the officers who'd see it that a new era was beginning. The station, a modest brick building with faded signage, had an air of abandonment. To anyone else, it might appear like just another small-town establishment, but Marcus felt the quiet resistance emanating from within those walls. He took a deep breath, stepped out of his car, and made his way toward the entrance, his footsteps firm, resonating against the early morning silence. As he entered the station, a young officer at the front desk looked up in surprise, his posture stiffening as his gaze settled on Marcus's captain insignia. "Captain Williams, sir," the officer stammered, visibly taken aback. "We weren't expecting you this early." Marcus nodded politely. "I like to get an early start. Officer Sanders." "Officer Sanders, sir," the young man replied, his voice slightly wavering. "Well, Officer Sanders," Marcus said, keeping his tone even, "it's good to meet you. I'm looking forward to working with you." The officer nodded, his expression a mixture of uncertainty and intrigue, before gesturing toward the main office area where other officers were gathering. As Marcus moved past the front desk, he took in the surroundings. The station was modest, functional, with a few desks arranged in rows and bulletin boards cluttered with notices and reports. The place felt stale, as if it had operated on autopilot for years, resistant to even the smallest changes. He could see the subtle hierarchy at play, who gravitated toward whom, and which officers maintained a quiet presence at the edges. His entrance didn't go unnoticed. Conversations quieted as officers turned to look at him, some with wary expressions, others with outright hostility. Marcus knew what they saw: a tall, commanding figure, a black man in a town where diversity was scarce and authority figures had, for generations, fit a very particular mold. He was an unfamiliar force, and it was clear from the sideways glances and murmurs that his presence disrupted the comfortable, established order. Then, as if on cue, the two officers he'd encountered the previous night, Johnson and Miller, appeared from a side room, laughing about something between them. Their laughter stopped abruptly when they noticed Marcus, and their faces immediately tightened into masks of thinly veiled resentment. Johnson straightened his shoulders, his posture shifting from relaxed to guarded, while Miller's casual smirk faded as he took a step back, his gaze flickering with discomfort. "Good morning, Officers Johnson and Miller," Marcus greeted them, his tone measured but carrying enough weight to command attention. "I trust you both had a chance to rest after our encounter last night." Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly, a barely concealed scowl crossing his face, before he forced a tight, humorless smile. "Captain Williams, we weren't aware." His voice trailed off, struggling to find words to match the palpable resentment in his eyes. "Yes, sir," Miller added quickly, his voice a tad too eager, as if to compensate for Johnson's lack of enthusiasm. "Didn't realize we'd be seeing you this early." Marcus maintained eye contact with each of them, letting the silence linger just long enough to make his point clear. This was his station now, and he wasn't here to entertain defiance or thinly veiled disrespect. He was here to lead. "I'm sure you'll get used to seeing me around early. I like to set an example," Marcus replied smoothly. "And I'll need full cooperation from every officer in this department, especially when it comes to upholding the standards expected of a team serving the community." The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. Officers around the room shifted uncomfortably, and Johnson's face flushed slightly, though he held his tongue. Marcus had seen this reaction many times before: pride bruised, authority questioned. Yet he remained unyielding, knowing that any perceived weakness would only undermine the work he had set out to accomplish. Without giving Johnson or Miller a chance to respond, Marcus directed his attention to the rest of the room. "All right, everyone," he announced. "I'll be holding a morning briefing in 15 minutes in the main conference room. I expect every officer to be there." The officers filed into the conference room in silence, some giving him curious glances, others averting their eyes. Johnson and Miller positioned themselves near the back, arms crossed, their postures defiant. Marcus was familiar with this tactic, the attempt to appear unaffected, even dismissive. But he wasn't here to play their games. He was here to set a tone, and he intended to do just that. Once everyone had settled, Marcus stood at the head of the room, scanning the faces of the officers before him. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "I'm Captain Marcus Williams. Many of you know by now that I'm new to this town, but I'm not new to this work. I've spent years in law enforcement, and I understand what it takes to create a team that respects both the badge and the people it serves. This is not about individual power or influence. This is about integrity, discipline, and accountability." His words landed heavily, stirring a mixture of reactions. Some officers nodded subtly, seemingly receptive to the message, while others, like Johnson and Miller, barely concealed their disdain. "I've reviewed the department's records," Marcus continued, his tone measured, "and it's clear there's room for improvement. Too many cases have gone unexamined, complaints dismissed without proper investigation. That changes today. Starting now, we're instituting a policy of full transparency. Every officer's conduct will be under review, and civilian complaints will be handled with the seriousness they deserve. We are here to serve, not to intimidate. If anyone feels otherwise, you're welcome to bring it to my attention directly. My door is always open." He let that offer sit for a moment, watching the reactions ripple across the room. Some officers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the idea of increased accountability, while a few exchanged quiet glances, seeming both relieved and cautiously optimistic. After the meeting, Marcus returned to his office, where a thick stack of internal files waited on his desk. He began his review, taking note of patterns, complaints swept under the rug, incidents of excessive force that hadn't been properly documented. He wasn't surprised, but each new piece of evidence confirmed the depth of the issues he'd be confronting. A light knock interrupted his concentration, and he looked up to see Officer Sanders standing in the doorway, holding a file in his hands. He seemed nervous but determined, his eyes flicking between Marcus and the file. "Captain Williams, I thought you might want to see this," Sanders said, holding the file out to him. "It's a record of recent civilian complaints that were filed over the past few months. A lot of them. They didn't really go anywhere. I thought it might be relevant." Marcus accepted the file, nodding appreciatively. "Thank you, Officer Sanders. Your initiative is noted. This is exactly the kind of transparency I was referring to. I'll take a close look at this." Sanders nodded, visibly relieved at the positive feedback, before he turned to leave. Marcus took a moment to flip through the file, his suspicions confirmed as he saw pages of complaints marked as dismissed or inconclusive, often with minimal follow-up. Patterns of misconduct began to emerge, shedding light on the lax standards that had been allowed to persist. Johnson and Miller's names appeared frequently, with allegations that hinted at bullying, excessive force, and outright discrimination. Marcus felt a surge of resolve. These patterns would not be allowed to continue. Later that day, as he made his way through the station, he noticed how conversations grew quieter as he passed by. Some officers offered polite nods, others averted their eyes. The tension was palpable, but he knew it was part of the process. Change would not come easily, and he'd likely encounter hostility before he saw progress. The weight of his task bore down on him, but he welcomed it. This was more than just a job. It was a mission, one he prepared for his entire career. Marcus knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to put in the work. One by one, he'd root out the old habits and force the department to face a new reality, one where accountability and respect were not just words but a daily practice. As he returned to his office, Marcus glanced at the bulletin board, where a notice he'd posted that morning was pinned prominently for all to see. It read, "Respect is the foundation of service. We're here to protect and serve every member of this community." With a slight nod of satisfaction, he closed his office door, ready to continue the work that lay ahead. Shadows of resistance. The days following Marcus's arrival brought with them a pervasive tension that seemed to seep into the walls of the police station. Marcus could sense it each time he walked the corridors, catching glimpses of half-hidden expressions, quickened whispers, and subtle shifts in body language. He knew this was part of the process. Change wasn't always welcome, especially in a place where the old ways had burrowed deep. It wasn't long before Marcus noticed the resistance solidifying, especially among certain members of the team. Officers like Johnson and Miller, who had mocked and disrespected him even before knowing his rank, were not the kind to simply fall in line. They represented the old guard, and he could sense their resentment festering, not just because he was an outsider, but because he symbolized a shift they weren't ready to accept. One morning, Marcus was in his office reviewing a particularly troubling report, a civilian complaint about excessive force used during a routine traffic stop. The details were vague, and it was clear the case had been hastily closed without a thorough investigation. Johnson's name was all over the report. Marcus felt a pang of frustration. This wasn't merely an isolated incident. It was part of a troubling pattern, but he knew this would have to be handled delicately if he wanted to foster lasting change. A knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts, and he looked up to see Officer Sanders standing in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and a concerned expression. "Captain Williams, I thought you might want a refill," Sanders offered, placing the cup on Marcus's desk. His tone carried a quiet respect that Marcus was beginning to appreciate. Sanders had been one of the few officers who hadn't reacted with skepticism or resentment when Marcus took over. The young officer seemed genuinely interested in learning, open to the new expectations Marcus had laid out. "Thanks, Sanders," Marcus replied, accepting the cup with a nod. "I've been reviewing some of these cases, and it seems like there's a lot here that hasn't been handled with the proper level of scrutiny." Sanders' expression grew cautious, and he lowered his voice. "I know, sir. It's been like that for a while now. I guess some officers they kind of close ranks when something comes up, especially if it involves certain people." Marcus didn't have to guess who he was referring to. Johnson, Miller, and a handful of others were woven into the fabric of the department's inner circle, using their tenure and connections to control the atmosphere. Sanders' hesitancy in speaking about it confirmed what Marcus already suspected. Challenging this dynamic would not only disrupt the station, but possibly fracture it. "I appreciate your honesty, Sanders," Marcus said, leaning forward slightly. "And I want you to know that I don't intend to sweep any of this under the rug. But I also need to be strategic. If we're going to change this culture, it has to be sustainable, something the entire team can stand behind." Sanders nodded, visibly relieved. "I understand, Captain. And if you need any help, I'm here." Marcus offered a slight smile, grateful for this small but significant show of support. In a place like this, where resistance was ingrained, even one ally made a difference. But he knew he'd need more than just Sanders to transform the department from the inside out. He'd have to convince even those resistant to him that there was a better way to do things. That same day, Marcus decided it was time to observe Johnson and Miller in action. He joined them on a routine patrol, a way to see firsthand how they operated. They weren't thrilled with the idea, but he made it clear it was an order, not a request. As they drove through town, Johnson in the driver's seat and Miller next to him, Marcus sat in the back, watching their every move and listening to their banter. "Pretty quiet day," Johnson remarked, glancing at Miller with a smirk. "Maybe the captain will get bored and decide we're not worth his time." Miller chuckled, clearly enjoying the jab. "Maybe he's just here for show. Make it look like he cares." Marcus didn't respond, letting the silence stretch as they continued their route. He knew they were testing him, trying to provoke him into a response, but he wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, he kept his gaze steady, watching as they pulled up to a four-way stop and observed a young man waiting on the curb, visibly nervous as he clutched his backpack. "What do you think, Miller?" Johnson asked, his tone a shade too eager. "This one looked like he's up to something." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He could see where this was heading. The young man on the curb hadn't done anything to warrant suspicion, yet Johnson and Miller seemed primed to use their authority as a weapon rather than a shield. "Hold on," Marcus interjected before they could step out of the car. Both officers turned to look at him, clearly taken aback. "What's the probable cause here?" he asked calmly. Johnson's face flushed, a flicker of irritation passing through his expression. "Captain, with all due respect, we've been doing this a long time. We know what to look for." "I'm sure you do," Marcus replied evenly. "But I don't see any probable cause here. This young man hasn't broken any laws, and there's nothing suspicious about him standing on a public street. We're here to protect and serve, not to intimidate." Miller shifted uncomfortably in his seat, exchanging a glance with Johnson, who clenched his jaw but nodded curtly. "Understood, sir." The patrol continued in silence after that, but Marcus could feel the resentment radiating off Johnson and Miller like a storm waiting to break. This wasn't the first time he'd had to check their behavior, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But he was committed to his role, determined to hold them accountable, no matter how much resistance he faced. Back at the station later that afternoon, Marcus returned to his office, mentally preparing himself for what he suspected would be a series of confrontations. He barely had time to sit down when Johnson appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of poorly concealed anger. "Captain, I need a word," Johnson said, his tone clipped. Marcus motioned for him to enter, keeping his expression neutral. Johnson closed the door behind him and crossed his arms, his stance defensive. "With all due respect, sir, I don't appreciate being micromanaged," Johnson began, his tone laced with bitterness. "I've been in this department for 15 years, and I know how to do my job. I don't need someone looking over my shoulder, second-guessing my every move." Marcus held his gaze, unshaken. "I understand, Officer Johnson. But my role as captain includes ensuring that every officer upholds the standards we're sworn to maintain. That includes respecting the rights of every citizen, not using our authority as a weapon. I'm here to make sure this department functions with integrity and accountability, not to entertain power trips or unchecked biases." Johnson's jaw clenched, his fists curling at his sides. "With all due respect, sir, you weren't here before. You don't understand how things work around here. We don't have the luxury of being soft. People need to know we're in charge." Marcus could feel his patience wearing thin, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Authority doesn't come from intimidation, Johnson. It comes from respect. And if we're not willing to respect the people we serve, then we don't deserve to wear this badge." The room fell into a tense silence as Johnson glared at him, his defiance still simmering beneath the surface. Finally, he muttered, "Understood, sir," before storming out of the office, the door slamming behind him. Marcus took a slow breath, the weight of the encounter settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew Johnson wouldn't be the last to challenge him, and he'd likely be dealing with similar resistance for months to come. But he couldn't allow it to deter him. Change, he reminded himself, was never easy. It was a process, often messy and painful, but always worth it. In the days that followed, Marcus continued his work with a steady resolve. He reviewed case files, restructured protocols, and took time to speak with each officer individually, learning about their backgrounds, concerns, and perspectives. Some officers were more receptive than others, their expressions softening as they realized that Marcus wasn't there to simply impose his authority, but to genuinely improve the department. Others, like Johnson and Miller, maintained a wall of hostility, their resentment barely concealed. One morning, Marcus was at his desk when Officer Sanders knocked on the door, holding a thin file in his hand. "Captain, I thought you might want to see this," Sanders said, handing over the file with a somber expression. It's a complaint from a few months ago. A civilian filed it against Johnson, claiming he'd used excessive force. The case was closed without investigation." Marcus's eyes darkened as he flipped through the pages. The complaint detailed an incident in which Johnson had allegedly pushed a civilian against a patrol car during a routine stop, causing visible bruising. The complaint had been dismissed, marked unsubstantiated, with no indication that any follow-up had been conducted. "Thank you, Sanders," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I'll take it from here." Sanders hesitated, then nodded, his gaze filled with a quiet determination. "I just want you to know, sir, not everyone here agrees with the way things have been done. Some of us, we believe in what you're trying to do." Marcus met Sanders' gaze, offering a small but genuine smile. "I appreciate that, Sanders, and I promise you, things are going to change. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but we're going to make it happen." As Sanders left, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, that officers like Johnson and Miller would continue to resist, to challenge his authority. But he also knew he wasn't alone. He had allies like Sanders, officers who believed in accountability, respect, and genuine service. They were the seeds of change, and together, they'd build a foundation that would last. Marcus took a final look at the complaint file in his hands, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle over him. It was time to act, to bring these issues to light, to force the department to face its own shadows. The journey ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for it. He was here to make a difference, and he wouldn't rest until every officer in the station understood the true meaning of their oath. The storm breaks. The department's resistance to change was no longer a subtle undercurrent Marcus had to guess at. It had solidified into something far more explicit, an unspoken but unmistakable divide. As the days passed, he became acutely aware of how deep the fractures ran and how his presence had exposed tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for years. Johnson and Miller, along with a handful of loyalists in the department, had become increasingly defiant, their acts of rebellion growing bolder by the day. Marcus knew he was in for a fight, but he hadn't come here expecting anything less. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus arrived at the station to find a small gathering of officers in the hallway, talking in hushed tones that cut off as soon as they noticed him. Johnson stood at the center of the group, his arms crossed, a smug smile on his face. When Marcus approached, Johnson turned his gaze on him, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "Good morning, Captain," Johnson said, his tone too casual, too bold. There was a hint of something else in his voice, a smirk just waiting to be unleashed. "Morning," Marcus replied, his voice steady, giving no hint of the frustration that churned beneath his calm exterior. "I'll be holding a team meeting in 10 minutes. Make sure everyone is in attendance." "Of course, sir," Johnson replied, his mock enthusiasm evident to anyone paying attention. Marcus moved past them, noting the flickers of rebellion in their eyes. In some, he saw open resentment. In others, an almost gleeful eagerness to see him fail. It was nothing new to him, but the weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. He'd known coming in that challenging the status quo would be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated this level of hostility. When the team assembled in the conference room, Marcus took his place at the head of the table, watching as each officer filed in. Johnson and Miller took seats near the back, their expressions carefully neutral, though Marcus could see the defiance simmering beneath the surface. He could feel the tension, thick and electric, as if the room itself were holding its breath. "Thank you all for coming," Marcus began, his tone calm but authoritative. "I called this meeting because we have some changes coming down from the district office that will affect the way we handle civilian complaints and internal reviews. Moving forward, there will be increased oversight and more stringent protocols for documenting interactions with the public." The announcement landed heavily. Marcus could see the discomfort, and in some cases, outright anger spreading across the faces in the room. Johnson's expression twisted into a scowl, and he exchanged a glance with Miller, who rolled his eyes. "I know this is a change," Marcus continued, refusing to be swayed by the resistance he was facing. "But this is non-negotiable. We're here to serve this community, and that means holding ourselves to the highest standards. I expect full compliance with these new protocols from every officer in this department." The room remained silent, but the tension was palpable. Marcus knew they were absorbing the reality of his expectations, realizing that he wasn't here to maintain the status quo. He was here to demand accountability, to ensure that each officer understood the weight of their badge. "Any questions?" Marcus asked, scanning the room. Johnson's hand shot up, his expression smug. "Yes, Captain. I've got a question. When exactly did we stop being allowed to use our own judgment in the field? These protocols you're talking about, they sound more like a way to tie our hands and prevent us from doing our jobs effectively." Marcus met Johnson's gaze head-on, his voice calm but unyielding. "These protocols are here to ensure that our interactions with the public are grounded in respect and fairness, Officer Johnson. Using judgment is one thing, but we're also accountable for that judgment. That means transparency. If we're doing our jobs with integrity, there should be no issue with oversight." Johnson's scowl deepened, but he said nothing more. Marcus continued with the meeting, explaining the details of the new protocols and answering questions, though few of the officers seemed willing to engage openly. As he wrapped up, Marcus noticed that several officers exchanged glances, as if preparing for something. Later that afternoon, Marcus received a message from the district office. An anonymous report had been filed against him. The nature of the complaint was vague, citing overreach and unnecessary oversight, with the implication that his presence was disruptive to the department. Marcus wasn't surprised. He knew exactly who had filed it. This was an attempt by Johnson and his allies to undermine his authority, to paint him as an outsider who didn't understand their town or its people. He sat back in his chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had two choices: let this attempt at sabotage undermine his position or confront it head-on. He decided on the latter. The department needed to understand that he was here to stay, and nothing they did would scare him off. That evening, Marcus requested a private meeting with the officers most openly aligned with Johnson and Miller. He knew they were the ones stirring up the most resistance, the ones who would need to be addressed directly if he had any hope of moving forward. He chose a quiet, out-of-the-way meeting room, wanting to speak openly, without the formalities of a typical briefing. When they arrived, Marcus took his place at the head of the small table, his posture relaxed but his gaze unwavering. Johnson leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, while Miller sat beside him, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began, keeping his voice steady. "I want to address the concerns some of you have raised, specifically the idea that my approach is somehow interfering with your ability to do your jobs." Johnson exchanged a quick glance with Miller, his smirk widening. "Well, Captain, it's just that we've been doing things a certain way here for a long time. Maybe we know this town a bit better than you do." Marcus nodded, acknowledging the unspoken challenge. "I respect experience, Officer Johnson. But experience doesn't excuse misconduct or shield us from accountability. We're all here to serve this community, and that means holding ourselves to a higher standard." Miller scoffed quietly, muttering something under his breath that Marcus didn't catch. But he kept his focus on Johnson, who seemed to be searching for a response, his expression hardening as the reality of Marcus's resolve began to set in. "Look," Johnson said, his tone shifting to something close to desperation. "This isn't some big city with endless resources. We're a small-town department, and people here don't need some outsider coming in and telling them how to live." Marcus's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "I may be an outsider to this town, but I'm not an outsider to the values that make a strong department. Respect, integrity, accountability. Those aren't big city ideals. They're universal." The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Marcus could feel the resistance in every set jaw, every narrowed gaze. But he knew he'd struck a chord. The officers weren't ready to accept him, but they were beginning to understand that he wasn't going to back down. Just then, the door opened, and Officer Sanders entered, a stack of reports in his hands. He seemed startled to see the tension in the room, hesitating as he held out the files. "Sorry, Captain," Sanders murmured, glancing around the room nervously. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's all right, Sanders," Marcus replied, taking the reports from him. "We were just finishing up." Sanders nodded, glancing warily at Johnson and Miller before excusing himself. As the door closed behind him, Marcus turned his attention back to the officers before him. "I'm here to work with you," he said, his tone firm but conciliatory. "But let me be clear. I'm not here to look the other way or let anyone misuse their authority. If you're not willing to hold yourselves to the standards we're setting, you're free to find another department." Johnson's face flushed with anger, his jaw clenched so tightly that the veins in his neck stood out. But he said nothing, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that Marcus's resolve was unshakable. Miller looked down, his smirk gone, replaced by something close to uncertainty. After a long, tense silence, Marcus rose from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady. "I hope we can work together moving forward." One by one, the officers filed out, leaving Marcus alone in the room. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the confrontation settle over him. He knew this was far from over, that the resistance would likely escalate before things got better. But he also knew he'd made his stance clear, that they understood he wasn't someone who could be intimidated or pushed aside. The next day, as he made his rounds through the station, Marcus noticed a subtle shift. The glances he received were still wary, but there was something else there, a grudging respect, a recognition that he wasn't here to play games. Even Johnson and Miller, though still hostile, seemed slightly subdued, as if they were beginning to understand that their tactics wouldn't work on him. In the afternoon, Marcus received another complaint from a civilian who had interacted with Johnson earlier that day. The report described an incident where Johnson had used aggressive language during a routine stop, intimidating the individual without cause. Marcus knew it was time to make an example. He called Johnson into his office, his tone firm as he explained the severity of the complaint. Johnson tried to brush it off, his usual arrogance flashing momentarily, but Marcus shut it down immediately. "This is your final warning, Johnson," Marcus said, his voice steely. "Any further misconduct, and there will be consequences. We're here to serve this community, not to use our positions as weapons." Johnson's face was a mixture of anger and frustration, but he managed a stiff nod before leaving the office, his steps heavy with resentment. Marcus watched him go, knowing that the battle was far from over. But as he sat back in his chair, Marcus felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew he was making a difference, that each confrontation, each challenge, was a step toward the transformation he'd envisioned for this department. It wouldn't be easy, and he'd likely face more resistance, more attempts to undermine him. But he was ready for it. The storm had broken, and now Marcus was prepared to weather it, knowing that with each stand he took, he was one step closer to the department he'd committed to building. Allies in the shadows. The tension between Marcus and the old guard continued to thicken in the days that followed, like storm clouds refusing to dissipate. Officer Johnson and his small group of loyalists had drawn their lines, and their disdain was no longer masked. They weren't just resisting Marcus's leadership. They were openly testing him, searching for cracks in his resolve. But for every blatant act of defiance, Marcus countered with calm authority, addressing each situation with an even hand and unyielding firmness. This was a marathon, not a sprint, and he had come prepared. However, Marcus wasn't alone. Though some officers had sided with Johnson, he began to notice a quieter faction emerging within the department. Officers who, like Sanders, saw Marcus as a leader willing to make changes that had long been overdue. They were cautious, keeping their support under wraps, but their presence gave Marcus the encouragement he needed. It was becoming clear that the change he was pushing for might find roots, if he could gather enough allies from within. One evening, as Marcus was about to leave the station, he heard a light knock on his office door. He looked up to see Officer Sanders standing there, a look of hesitation and purpose on his face. "Come on in, Sanders," Marcus said, gesturing for him to take a seat. "What's on your mind?" Sanders entered, glancing nervously over his shoulder before closing the door behind him. He seemed on edge, his usual composed demeanor replaced with an air of cautious determination. Once seated, he leaned forward, speaking in a low voice. "Captain, I thought you should know something," Sanders began, his voice hesitant. "There are officers here who want to see this department change. Some of us, we've been here a few years, but we don't agree with how things have been handled. We want to support you, but we're afraid." "Afraid of Johnson?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Sanders nodded. "Yeah, him and Miller. They're the ones everyone looks to. They'd been here longer than most, and they've built a network. You'd be surprised at how much they control around here. They've even got people in admin who will cover for them." Marcus took in Sanders' words, the reality of the situation sinking in even deeper. He'd suspected that Johnson and Miller held sway, but he hadn't fully grasped the extent of their influence. This wasn't just resistance to change. This was a culture entrenched in power plays, alliances, and manipulation. Johnson wasn't simply a bully. He was the ringmaster of an operation that thrived on secrecy and intimidation. "Thank you for telling me this, Sanders," Marcus said, his voice. "Even I need to know what I'm dealing with. But I also want you to know that this isn't just about me. It's about making this department a place we can all be proud of. I'm not here to turn a blind eye to what's been happening." Sanders nodded, the relief visible on his face. "I believe that, Captain. And I know others do, too. There's a handful of us who are ready to support you. But we're also, well, we're scared of what Johnson might do if he finds out. He's known to retaliate." Marcus placed a hand on his desk, leaning forward slightly. "Sanders, I understand your concern, and I'm not asking anyone to risk their safety or job security. But if we're going to turn this department around, I need allies who are willing to take a stand. It doesn't have to be public, but even small acts of integrity can make a difference." Sanders gave a small, resolute nod. "I think we're ready for that, Captain. There are a few of us who'll quietly support you however we can. Just know that we're here." After Sanders left, Marcus sat alone in his office, a glimmer of hope beginning to take root. Sanders' words were the first sign that change might be more achievable than he'd dared to hope. If he could quietly mobilize those who supported his vision, he might be able to break the hold that Johnson and Miller had over the department without a full-scale confrontation. Over the next few weeks, Marcus began to subtly cultivate support among the officers who seemed amenable to his approach. He didn't push them or force them into anything, but he took the time to listen, to understand their concerns, and to let them see his dedication to the department's improvement. Slowly but surely, he saw the shift. Some officers, previously wary, began to greet him with respectful nods and took greater care in following protocols. Others sought him out for advice, asking questions about his vision for the department and how they could support it without drawing unwanted attention. One evening, Marcus found himself meeting with Officer Brown, one of the younger members of the team who had expressed interest in the changes he was proposing. Brown was sharp, observant, and quietly committed to the principles of integrity and fairness that Marcus championed. They sat in a small cafe away from the station, speaking in low voices as they went over some recent cases that Marcus had reopened for further review. "Captain, I have to say, it's refreshing to see someone taking a stand on these issues," Brown said, his voice filled with a cautious optimism. "I've seen complaints get dismissed without a second glance, and I've been told to look the other way too many times." "That's exactly why I'm here, Brown," Marcus replied, his tone steady but resolute. "I'm here to ensure that this department functions with transparency and respect, not fear and favoritism." Brown nodded, glancing around the cafe before leaning forward. "You know, Captain, Johnson's got dirt on almost everyone in the department. He's careful about it, too. The minute someone speaks out, he leaks something. Could be anything, a mistake, a complaint that was buried. He's been building his leverage for years, and that's why no one challenges him." Marcus absorbed this information, a growing sense of the complexity of Johnson's influence settling over him. Johnson had been operating like a kingpin, wielding personal information as a weapon to keep his subordinates in check. He wasn't just resistant to change. He was fighting for his survival in a system he had molded to his benefit. "Thank you for telling me this, Brown," Marcus said, a note of appreciation in his voice. "It helps to know what we're dealing with, and I want you to know that I'm committed to protecting every officer who's willing to stand up for what's right." As the weeks passed, Marcus became increasingly aware of the web Johnson had spun within the department. It wasn't just the officers who were under his influence. Johnson had formed alliances with key figures in the local government, the very people responsible for approving budgets, assigning oversight, and managing the department's public image. It was a fortress of power, one that would not crumble easily. But Marcus knew he had to try. One evening, he received an email from the district office, informing him of an upcoming inspection. This was standard procedure, but Marcus suspected that Johnson and his supporters might use it as a means to undermine him, perhaps by highlighting minor issues or exaggerating problems. But instead of feeling threatened, Marcus saw this as an opportunity. He called a meeting with the officers he trusted, including Sanders, Brown, and a few others who had quietly shown their support. "Here's what I want us to focus on," Marcus began, looking around at the small group gathered in his office. "We're going to put our best foot forward. I want everything documented, every interaction handled with the utmost professionalism. If there's anything questionable in the records, let me know. We're going to make sure we're beyond reproach, and we're going to demonstrate that accountability isn't something to be feared." The officers nodded, their faces resolute. Sanders gave Marcus a slight nod of encouragement, his quiet support unwavering. Brown leaned forward, his voice filled with determination. "We're with you, Captain. Let's show them what we're capable of." In the days leading up to the inspection, Marcus doubled down on his efforts, making sure every policy was followed to the letter, that every file was complete, and every officer was briefed on the importance of handling the inspection professionally. He knew Johnson and his allies would be looking for any opportunity to undermine him, but he was determined to deny them that chance. On the morning of the inspection, the district officials arrived, their expressions neutral as they were greeted by Marcus and escorted through the station. Johnson hovered nearby, his expression carefully blank, though Marcus could see the glint of satisfaction in his eyes, as if he were anticipating some slip-up that would give him leverage. The inspection proceeded smoothly, with the district officials reviewing files, observing procedures, and interviewing officers. Marcus kept a close eye on Johnson and Miller, who seemed to be whispering to each other, their expressions filled with barely concealed smugness. But Marcus remained calm, confident that the department would meet the standards he had worked so hard to uphold. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself in the conference room with the officials, answering questions about his leadership approach, his vision for the department, and the changes he had implemented. He spoke candidly, explaining his commitment to accountability and his efforts to create a culture of respect and integrity. The officials listened carefully, nodding as he outlined his strategy for addressing the issues that had plagued the department. When the inspection concluded, one of the officials shook his hand, offering a brief but sincere smile. "Captain Williams, it's clear you're committed to making a positive impact here," she said, her tone respectful. "We'll be in touch with the results of our inspection, but from what we've seen today, you're leading this department in the right direction." As the officials left, Marcus felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing that he had successfully navigated one of the biggest challenges he had faced since arriving. He could see the frustration etched on Johnson's face, the realization that his attempts to undermine Marcus had been thwarted. But as the officers filed out of the conference room, Marcus noticed that several of them, Sanders, Brown, and a few others, gave him subtle nods of respect and appreciation. They had seen his strength, his commitment, and they understood that he wasn't just an outsider forcing change. He was someone they could trust, someone who had their best interests and the community's well-being at heart. For the first time since his arrival, Marcus felt that he was truly making progress. The walls Johnson had built around himself were beginning to crack, the influence he had wielded for so long beginning to erode. And while the road ahead was still fraught with challenges, Marcus knew he had allies who believed in his vision, allies who were willing to stand with him, even in the shadows. As he left the station that evening, the crisp autumn air filling his lungs, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the end of the struggle. It was only the beginning. But he was ready, and he knew that with each passing day, the department was becoming stronger, more united, and closer to the vision he had set out to achieve. Turning the tide. The chill of early winter had begun to settle over the town as Marcus drove to the station one morning, frost glinting off rooftops and street signs. It had been months since he'd taken over as captain, and though he felt the weight of his responsibilities more than ever, there was a growing sense of progress that buoyed him through the colder days. The department, once resistant and guarded, was slowly starting to come around. The efforts he'd made with officers like Sanders and Brown had started to bear fruit, and he could see a shift in the way the department operated. The deep-rooted culture of intimidation and abuse that Johnson and his allies had fostered was beginning to fracture. But he knew better than to think the battle was won. As Marcus walked into the station that morning, he noticed something unusual. Johnson and Miller, typically the loudest presences in the room, were huddled together in tense conversation near the coffee machine, their faces drawn and serious. They stopped talking as Marcus approached, their expressions turning to something darker, something that carried a sense of impending retaliation. "Good morning, gentlemen," Marcus greeted them evenly, his voice carrying the authority that had become second nature. "Hope you're both ready for the week. We've got a lot to cover." Johnson muttered a barely audible "morning," his eyes narrowing slightly, but Miller kept his gaze fixed on the floor. Marcus continued walking, unfazed. He had more pressing matters to address today. In his office, Marcus reviewed the latest report from the district office detailing the results of the recent inspection. He'd received a formal letter praising the department's improvements and noting the strides made toward transparency and accountability. The officials had recommended continued oversight, but had acknowledged Marcus's leadership as a positive force within the department. It was a significant victory, one that reaffirmed his belief that the work he was doing was making a difference. However, as he set down the letter, his phone buzzed with a notification. A message from Brown appeared on his screen. "Captain, I think Johnson is planning something. Heard him talking to Miller about a big surprise for you. Thought you should know." Marcus felt a surge of frustration mingled with a familiar resolve. This was typical of Johnson, a final attempt to assert control, to sabotage Marcus's authority and derail his efforts to reshape the department. But Marcus was ready. He'd anticipated this, knowing that someone as entrenched in power as Johnson wouldn't go down quietly. After a moment of reflection, he decided to confront the situation directly. But instead of calling Johnson and Miller into his office, Marcus planned to address the entire department. He wanted everyone to hear the stakes, to understand that this was about more than just departmental politics. It was about principles, accountability, and respect for the community they served. He sent a message instructing all officers to gather in the conference room at noon, leaving no room for ambiguity. This was going to be a turning point, one way or another. At noon, the conference room filled with officers, their expressions a mix of curiosity, caution, and, among some of the newer officers, anticipation. Johnson and Miller sat near the back, their posture closed off and defiant, while Sanders and Brown positioned themselves closer to the front, their support visible but unspoken. Marcus took his place at the head of the room, waiting until every conversation had fallen silent and every eye was on him. He held their gaze with the steady assurance that had become his hallmark, letting the silence emphasize the gravity of the moment. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone measured but unwavering. "Today, I want to address something that's been simmering for too long, an issue that affects not just me or the leadership of this department, but each and every one of you. It's about the values we stand for, the community we serve, and the integrity of this badge." He paused, letting his words settle. He could see a few officers exchange uneasy glances, but most were watching him intently, their focus unwavering. "Since I arrived, I've made it clear that this department must be a place where respect, accountability, and professionalism are upheld at every level," he continued, his voice carrying an edge of determination. "I know this hasn't been easy for everyone. Change is difficult, especially when it challenges long-standing practices. But our duty is to this community. That's what we signed up for when we chose to wear this badge." His gaze shifted to Johnson and Miller, who met his stare with barely disguised resentment. Johnson's face was flushed, his jaw set tightly, and Marcus could tell he was holding back a response. "I know some of you are resistant to these changes," Marcus went on, addressing Johnson directly, though his words were meant for the entire department. "And I understand that. But undermining this department, threatening the progress we're making, that's not just defiance. That's a betrayal of everything we stand for." The tension in the room was palpable, a tangible force that seemed to hang in the air. Johnson leaned forward, his face twisted with barely concealed anger. "Captain, with all due respect," he said, his tone biting, "some of us feel like we've been doing just fine before you got here. We don't need an outsider telling us how to do our jobs." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. Officer Johnson, just fine isn't enough. Just fine is the bare minimum. The community deserves better than just fine. They deserve respect, they deserve transparency, and they deserve to trust us. If that's something you can't stand behind, then maybe this isn't the right place for you. Johnson's face went pale, and for a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Miller shifted uncomfortably beside him, his usual smirk replaced with something closer to fear. Marcus had laid it out plainly. There was no more room for power games, no more tolerance for the intimidation tactics that had once ruled this department. Silence filled the room, a heavy, charged silence that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Finally, Sanders broke it, his voice calm but resolute. "Captain's right," Sanders said, his voice steady. "We owe it to the community and to each other to do better. This department has been too divided for too long, and it's time we remember why we're here." Brown nodded, adding his own voice to the quiet support. "If we're serious about serving the people, then we need to be able to trust each other, and we need to be worthy of their trust." The words hung in the air, a beacon of solidarity that was beginning to replace the fractured silence. Marcus felt a surge of gratitude toward Sanders, Brown, and the others who had quietly supported him, even when it meant facing the hostility of their peers. Johnson seemed to realize he was losing control, his influence slipping as the room rallied around Marcus. His face contorted with fury, and he stood up abruptly, slamming his hands on the table. "I don't have to listen to this," he snarled. "I've been in this department longer than any of you. I know how this town works, and I don't need some captain lecturing me on integrity." Marcus remained calm, his gaze steady. "Johnson, if you feel it strongly, you're welcome to leave. But if you stay under my leadership, and you adhere to the standards I've set." For a long moment, it seemed like Johnson might lash out, his fists clenching at his sides, his face a mask of rage. But finally, he shook his head, muttering under his breath as he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was thick, but it was different now. There was a sense of relief, a sense that something heavy had finally been lifted. Miller looked around uncertainly, as if realizing he was no longer the dominant force in the room. He, too, eventually left, though he did so quietly, his head down. Marcus took a steadying breath, his gaze sweeping over the remaining officers. "Thank you all," he said, his voice quieter now, but filled with conviction. "Thank you for your commitment. This department has a future, and I promise you, it's a future we can be proud of. I won't let you down." The officers nodded, some even offering small smiles, and as they filed out, Marcus felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew Johnson and Miller weren't gone forever. They'd likely rally their resistance in new ways. But their influence had been broken, and Marcus had seen that he had the support he needed to rebuild the department from within. In the weeks that followed, Marcus noticed a palpable change. The officers were more engaged, more open to the new protocols and training sessions he implemented. Sanders and Brown became leaders within the ranks, quietly guiding their peers and reinforcing the values Marcus had introduced. The department began conducting regular community outreach programs, organizing events with local schools and neighborhood associations to rebuild the trust that had been lost over the years. One day, a young woman approached Marcus at one of these events, her face filled with gratitude. She introduced herself as the sister of a man who had once filed a complaint against the department, a complaint that had gone ignored under Johnson's watch. Tears glistened in her eyes as she thanked Marcus for making things better and for being someone the community could trust. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "It means so much, knowing there's someone who cares. My brother, he felt so alone after what happened. But now, maybe things can change." Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, the gravity of her words settling deep within him. This was why he'd come here, why he'd endured the resistance, the hostility, and the isolation. This was why he'd stayed. As he watched the community interact with his officers, talking, laughing, sharing their stories. Marcus felt a surge of pride and fulfillment. This department, once shrouded in shadows of intimidation and secrecy, was becoming something new, something honorable. It was slow work, often painful and fraught with setbacks, but it was worth every moment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the gathering, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He'd come to this town as an outsider, faced with a wall of resistance and prejudice. But he'd stayed, pushing through the doubt and defiance, because he believed in what this department could become. And now, standing here among the very people he'd set out to serve, he felt the weight of his journey transform into a sense of belonging. For the first time, Marcus felt he wasn't just a captain imposed upon a resistant team. He was their leader. And together, they would continue to build something enduring, something that would serve the community with honor and integrity for years to come.